They cut the chain at 9 in the morning, the padlock coming away with a sound like a coin dropped in a cathedral. The steel door had not been opened in 50 years. Its paint had blistered to the color of nicotine, and the stenciled code, S38/West Siding, was half gone where damp had licked it. Two electricians pushed and felt something give, a tacky surrender. Then air moved in a way it hadn't for half a century. Their breath made small clouds, even though it was July. The tunnel held winter in its stones. A high click traveled off into the dark, the sound of a switch that still believed in circuits. When the men shone their torches over the lip of the threshold, the beam found the rounded end of a red and cream underground car, a 1962 stock carriage left here sometime in the mid-1970s and never called back. A spider had flung a line across the headcode box. The characters inside still read 3, the rest peeled or eaten by time. The first torch slid along the painted side and caught a window with a film of dust no wiper had broken, then a door that bore a yellowed notice. Do not use, taped on with brittle cellophane. Keep it closed until they come, one of the men said, though they had already opened it. The siding was on a disused spur off the Piccadilly line between Holborn and Russell Square, a maintenance spur rarely mapped except on old sheets and in the notebooks of men who knew where London kept its bones. In the 1970s, the Holborn, Aldwych shuttle had finally given up its ghost. Cars had been shunted and stabled in odd places while the city made up its mind. This one had been pushed into the spur and left, the door chalked with a date and a signature that the damp had pulled down into a blur. Then someone had locked the gate and gone on holiday or retired or died. The tunnel forgot on purpose the way tunnels do, closing over it as neatly as a mouth pocketing a seed. When the transport engineers came with clipboards and quiet faces, they wore the kind of respect you put on for a place that has found a way to keep a secret this long. They ran a finger along the rubber edge of the carriage door, and the rubber shed a skin. When they put a shoulder to it, the door shifted inward with a sound like a punctured lung. The smell came out first. Not rot. Rot needs air, but a dry sweetness, old tea dried in a mug, wool gone to dust, the scratch of paper seeded with mildew. Then the light found the inside. 4 rows of maquette benches facing, a floor of lino latticed with cracks, a ceiling that had shed its paint in strips that hung down like fish skin. A newspaper lay like a leaf near the driver's door, the headline inconceivably cheap and loud. Strike OFF, trains on. The date had soaked and split, but you could make out 1975 if you had learned to read wreckage. On the right-hand bench, 3 seats down from the end where a partition framed the doorway, a man sat with his knees just wider than his boots, hands resting on his thighs as if he had meant to stand, and found the reason for standing had evaporated. Or rather what time had kept of him sat there. A skeleton in a suit that had collapsed into the outline of itself, a coat that had become a suggestion, a tie that had turned to a stripe of thread, leather shoes cupped in on themselves, socks fossilized into ash. On his left wrist, on the radius just above the wrist bones, a thin leather bracelet had dried to a ring the color of tea. The brass button of its clasp was green where the air had kissed it. In the coat pocket nearest the aisle, something hard had changed the drape of the cloth. When an officer reached with 2 gloved fingers and coaxed it upward, a small black notebook with an elastic band came up like a fish pulled out of silt. The elastic was stiff as wire. Tucked into it was a photograph, the edges nibbled by invisible mouths. A woman in a patterned dress squinted into summer light. Beside her, a boy scowled the way boys do when told to pose. Behind them, a lake glared like a coin. On the seat next to the man, upright in impossible balance, sat a white enamel mug with a chip on its lip. The brown circle inside had dried into a memory of tea. When the first report went upstairs, it was short. Disused stock found S38/YS siding. Deceased seated in passenger saloon. Possible historic missing person. Notify Met Police. Notify TFL Heritage. Notify Coroner. Someone wrote a line that did not look like official language, but was the only true sentence available. He was waiting. His name, in life, was Thomas Hardy. No relation to the dead novelist. He always said to new clerks at the office and watched their faces fall because the joke lived in the awkwardness after. He was 41 in November of 1975, a clerk at the Inland Revenue Office off Kingsway, the kind of man who knew the weight of paper and the speed of cues, who wore his hair cut close because there wasn't enough left to pretend. He carried a metal lunch tin with a dent in the lid, a thermos of tea that he poured into a small enamel mug even at his desk, because mugs are a kind of optimism, and a paperback with a cheap spine he broke and then mended with tape. He wore a metal watch that had stopped 2 minutes slow and stayed that way for years. On his left wrist he wore, though his colleagues never noticed, a braided leather bracelet his wife had plaited for him when his father died. She had tied the brass stud through as if locking in luck. In the inside pocket of his coat, he kept a black notebook with a tight elastic, not a diary exactly, but a town of lists. Invoices to pull, bits that needed mending in the flat, books to borrow from the library, things to tell his son without sounding like he was preaching. Tucked into the band around the book, he kept a photograph from the summer they had gone to Shepperton and stolen an afternoon by the water in a year when there had been no spare afternoons at all. On the evening he disappeared, he left his office at 5:15 with the rest, nodded to a woman who always left her cigarette for him to step over, turned his collar up against a rain that had not yet started but would, and walked down Kingsway toward Holborn because that is what his shoes had been trained to do. At the turnstiles he fished in his pocket for a book of deep red tickets, two left with a corner folded, and took the westbound Piccadilly, as he had taken it every weekday since 1971 when the new line from the suburbs made the choice easier. He bought the Evening Standard because he liked to have something to fold and pretend to read. The platform announcer's voice had the class of tiredness that belongs to November. There was a strike on or off, the headlines argued. There were delays. The dot matrix board stuttered between Hounslow West and Rayners Lane because the bulbs were ill, and Thomas thought about whether they had milk and whether the dog would have gotten out of the yard if the boy hadn't checked the latch. He turned the page without reading and thought of the damp that crept under the cheap insulation in the flat. He thought, precisely, of nothing. The last person to recall him is not sure if it was him at all. A woman who took in typing sat under the station clock to rest because her knees had begun to have weather. She remembers a man lining his ticket stub with his thumbnail against the metal of his case. She remembers the way people hold mugs without thinking, a curve of fingers learned in cold kitchens. She thinks he wore a coat too thin for the month. She is sure there was a leather bracelet, because she did not expect it there. She cannot swear that when the train doors opened, he was among those who pressed in. The body's memory of faces is not made for police work. The station cameras in 1975 were not what they are now. The policemen who looked at the grays of that evening saw only men in coats with shoulders the same shape. Someone thought they saw Thomas change at Holborn for the Central because there had been word that the Piccadilly was running slow. Someone else thought they saw him turn back to the ticket office to ask about a delayed train because he was that sort of man. The family waited for him at 6 and at 7 and then set the plates aside, and then at 11 his wife telephoned the station and said a lot of words that did not amount to a sentence with a verb in it. In the morning she went to the police and put his name into a mouth that did not know it. The search was ordinary, which is not the same as small. A man goes missing in London and the city yawns and shows you all the other men it has eaten. Constables walked the streets between Holborn and his block in Hounslow. Asked in pubs where he might have taken the one drink that turns two turns three. Asked at hospitals where men go to wake up embarrassed. Asked at morgues where no one wakes at all. His wife looked at the dog and told the dog that this was nothing but a fool's delay. The dog put his head on her knee and had no more ideas than she did. The boy went to school because boys are always made to. And there in maths he thought if he multiplied his father's footsteps by any number the sum would be some kind of return. They combed the river because London always imagines water when it cannot think of an end. A reel of newsprint on the 21st of November ran in the back pages a short column with a title that sounded sympathetic even as it did the first part of forgetting. Civil servant fails to return home. The paragraph lied the way good paragraphs do, with verbs that smooth. Left work, boarded a train, has not been seen. There were friends, all of whom said there was no debt, no lover, no illness serious enough to go missing for. There was a manager who said he had shown up with his tie straight. There was a neighbor who said he had taken the bins out on Tuesday and not banged the lid. The police wrote, because they had to, possible voluntary absence, possible foul play, possible misadventure. London wrote, because it always does, that the underground is a system with tunnels curving like intestines and things get lost. The family's grief turned from wet to dry. His wife and stopped moving plates and started making lists like he had, because lists were prayers for people who could not kneel. She called every fortnight for a while, and then every month, and then not at all because the answer was always an answer shape with no body in it. She kept the photograph of herself and their son at Shepperton on the mantel, not because she liked to see herself young, she did not, but because she liked to remember the minute before the picture when he had been making the boy laugh. She resented the bracelet he had worn, then missed it. She had no idea where he had put his notebook. She found his enamel mug on a shelf and kept it there because it held the smell of tea and metal, which was the smell of being married then. The city paved over bits of itself and pulled other bits up as if loosening stones in a field. The Aldwych branch closed. The 1962 stock retired and was cannibalized for parts. A handful were used as training rigs for fire services down at Charing Cross. Some became gardens of rust and sidings at Acton. One or two went out as film extras. The spur between Holborn and Russell Square became a line on a map only men who had worked it could draw. The gate remained locked. Someone wrote S38/YS on a form and then left the form at the bottom of a drawer. The damp went on with its patient arithmetic. The man in the car waited, though waiting implies a will that time had long since unbuttoned and set aside. The carriage did what carriages do when there is no timetable. It became a room. Silt thickened on the window sills like the edge of a coin left in your pocket through wash and dry and wash again. The red of the paint turned the brown of a dried cherry. The seats shed their blue maquette in little hailstorms whenever air shifted. The enamel mug held a circle the color of leaf tea left to die all day on a stove. The notebook slept in his pocket, absorbing the damp slow as a sermon, its elastic becoming a tendon you did not notice until you touched it, and it twanged. The photograph unfaded past the point where the boy's hair blurred and the lake became rumor. Mice came and went and made nothing of him. A spider tried a line between his knee and the seat. A drip in winter on the far end of the carriage set a metronome for a season. When the car was opened and the news made its way up to a room where someone could say yes to taking the door off, the city made a sound like recognition without knowing quite what it recognized. The Evening Standard ran with it first because the Evening Standard always believes the tube is London's spinal cord. Skeleton found in abandoned tube carriage read the late editions. Within hours, the BBC had a presenter standing near a taped corridor, the word grisly fattening in his mouth, and then being popped delicately by the next sentence. Transport for London called it a historic discovery of potential significance for a long-standing missing persons case. Someone sent a photo of the enamel mug to a friend who sent it to a friend who put it online with a caption about tea that made more strangers cry than they would have believed possible on a Friday afternoon. His name came back by trawling a long, sad ocean. The coroner's office, delicate with its little brushes, found in the inner pocket of his coat the black notebook. The elastic did not want to yield. When it did, the first page was a list, in thick pencil that had not entirely surrendered to damp. Dog biscuits, butter, carnation milk, stamps, 2D. Ask it counter. Drain on blocker. Tell Peter about the football card he lost. I found it under the sofa. On the inside cover, in a slanted hand that had gotten more tired in the last years, a name and a number. Hardy, T. 9, Clitheroe Road, Hounslow. The number was short enough to break your heart. The photograph tucked into the band matched the one the boy, now a man with the hairline his father had, kept on his mantle. The bracelet was described in the family statement in 1975. A ring, cheap, plated, had gone. His watch had not. The coroner wrote, identification by effects consistent with Hardy, Thomas, born in 1934, missing since 1975, dental comparison consistent, DNA unlikely given time and condition, family to be consulted. The family was consulted. The man with the hairline put his hand on the notebook as if he intended to lift it, and then did not. The diary that was not quite a diary had entries scattered like furniture after a move. He wrote in it, as if passing himself messages between stations. Holborn Milk. Peter, stop running, watch the rails. Monday, no more putting off the dentist. Anne's bracelet, ask her to oil the clasp. August, save for the trip to Shepperton again, bring a bigger thermos. Then, early in November, thicker pencil lines that pushed into the paper. Strikes again. Leave early. Holborn runs better. Corridor at Holborn smells like piss. Asked the man about the shuttle to Aldwych, and he said closed more than open. Avoid. A week later, and says keep the ledger in the bottom drawer. She is right. Told her about the drain. Must stop the damp before it gets in the plaster. The last thing written was not a sentence, but a familiarity. T. The Metropolitan Police wrote an internal note that carried humility like a bruise. The subject appears to have boarded a Piccadilly line service and entered abandoned rolling stock in an isolated siding. The circumstances of entry are unknown. No evidence of trauma consistent with assault. No evidence of ligature or binding. Postmortem suggests position seated at or near time of death. Given the environment, death likely due to hypoxia or exposure. How he got there was the city's unsolvable question. Theories sprouted as quickly as news sites could refresh. He had been ill and wandered. He had been curious and moved into a carriage he imagined still in use. He had followed an instruction or an invitation he could not later refuse. One story wound stubbornly, loud on telephone calls to radio stations. He had been chased by men, cops, thugs, and had slipped the heavy door behind him, and the door had done what heavy doors do if you let them. Another, more prosaic, more cruel in its ordinariness. A staff error, a miscommunication, a night where a signalman shut the wrong gate, and a little life was refolded into iron. Transport men with decades in their boots shook their heads at the simpler conspiracies and held a space open for the smaller ones. A retired guard said, I've slept in cars between shifts, I won't lie, but you don't forget the doors. The doors remember you, though. They'll lift a little if you go wrong. An engineer said, that spur, it's awkward, a bite out of a dog that got bred out of the line after. You could push a thing in there and never think to fetch it if your map was wrong. An archivist from TfL brought out a dog-eared shunner's note from 1975 that recorded 1x62 stock to S38/YS for stabling until inspection, and then nothing, a line that stops like breath. There are details that make a man human to strangers. In his coat pocket, a folded paper had a penciled recipe for cheese and onion pie in a hand that was not his. Anne's, with measurements hedged, a little more if the crust is dry. A train ticket stub was jammed into the back of the notebook with a note. Ask about Peter's school trip money. The enamel mug had a hairline crack on the lip that, if you tried to drink from it, would let a thin line of tea creep down your wrist and make you swear, then laugh. The leather bracelet's brass button had a nick in it in the shape of a crescent. The son remembered it because he had once caught it with a toy car. When the press asked the son what he felt, he said something that a better writer would have invented. That he'd been on the same line the whole time. We just didn't know which branch. His mother, who was very old now and had learned to call grief by its Sunday name, did not speak to the cameras. In a small room, she asked to hold the notebook. She put her thumb over the word T. She was not told that before the first constable touched the book, a young engineer had done the same and had been surprised by the sharpness of the elastic when it snapped without snapping. The coroner did something decent. He allowed the family to come down to the siding before the car was moved, to stand by the door and look into the carriage where the man had kept his last seat. They were not asked to step in. They were not asked to touch anything. They were allowed to hold the light themselves. The son raised the torch and saw a pattern in the dust on the floor that no one else had noticed. A ring half an inch wide where his father's mug had sat for long enough to leave a clean halo. The light made the halo gleam and then lose itself again. The son lowered the beam and said thank you to no one in particular, to the carriage perhaps, or the city, or the men who had not thrown the mug away. There were ceremonies. London insists on them when it remembers it has a heart. A small one in a crematorium in Hounslow where the vicar said the two blinds are a web and webs hold. And the family did not roll their eyes because that would have insulted the effort. And the enamel mug sat on the table beside the lilies, and someone put a tea bag in it as a joke that no one laughed at because it was close to perfect. A slightly larger one on a platform at Holborn where Heritage set up a lectern and a small board that said, in memory of Thomas Hardy, 1934 to 1975, discovered 2025, whose journey ended here. City workers took off their caps. A retired guard who had worn his cap, even in his dreams, put his hand to the brim that wasn't there anymore and made the gesture anyway. A woman who had taken in typing and remembered a man lining his ticket stub clicked her tongue softly because the noise of trains had taught her to praise in percussive code. Theories calcified into four because human beings adore the plural of maybe. The practical. He stepped into the wrong car, the old shuttle siding now a blind room, and the heavy door took him. The administrative. A night inspection went awry. A man told a man told a man, and the mouth of the siding closed. The criminal. He was pushed into the car, and the men who did it drank to their relief for a week and then never spoke of it, not even to themselves. The metaphysical. For those who stand too long at platform ends. The underground tolerates a few ghosts per century and prefers their manners. He had the kind of patience that makes a good commuter and a good ghost. What remains matters more than what happened, sometimes. The diary with its lists civilized as pews. The photograph with the late glare, the boy scowling, the woman not yet old. The bracelet that had cut a faint ring into skin. The enamel mug that made strangers remember the taste of tea exactly the way it tastes after you've run for a train and made it anyway. The suit that became a map of cloth's faithlessness. The station clock that did not, in fact, run 5 minutes slow that evening, and yet in someone's memory did. The spur that bent away and back to the main line like a thought you have while reading and only later realize changed the chapter. In the weeks after, some people went to the Transport Museum and stared too long at the 1962 stock on display, the red rounded noses, the inside partitions with their glass squares, the signs that read "No smoking" and carried the shape of ash anyway. They sat on a bench and imagined sitting forever. They were jealous for a minute because to be sealed into one's route is a kind of peace. Then they corrected themselves and bought a postcard because you must leave something money can trace when you leave a museum. A group of schoolchildren coming through with a teacher who loved railways more than she loved her pension stood in front of the photograph of the Holborn shuttle, and the teacher did not tell them the story because teachers decide carefully which stories not to teach. One night, weeks later, a driver running empty stock toward Cockfosters felt the air change in the tunnel around Russell Square the way it does when there is a gap where no gap should be. He heard a sound like a cup settling on a saucer in a room he could not see. He did not tell anyone because he had a mortgage, and the city does not pay extra for men who listen to metaphors. He went home and said to his wife, "We had a strange bit. The wind skipped." And his wife poured tea into a mug and did not overfill it. And neither of them mentioned any of the names that had inflated and burst in the papers that week, because names are helium and marriage is air. The official report has its end in the voice you would expect. The Metropolitan Police conclude that no criminal act can be inferred. Transport for London records the discovery and commits to a program of auditing all disused sidings and locked stock. The coroner gives a verdict that is not a verdict, because he is honest. The clerk who typed the minutes of the Holborn ceremony spelled his name without the E and then corrected it. The city moved on the way a train does when the signal shows a green you decide to trust. And, in the little flat where the damp had been banished not by money but by her stubbornness, put the enamel mug on the mantel next to the photograph and the boy's old football badge. She put the bracelet in a drawer where she kept elastic bands and pictures torn out of catalogs because she liked to make a collage of a room she knew she would never own. She considered wearing it and did not, because some weights are not for wrists. She made tea and put too much sugar in it because at that hour you could. She drank and burned her lip a little, and if you had asked her what she felt she would have said annoyed. Then she would have said nothing. Then she would have changed the subject. She had learned. She would bore you with this if you let her. That feeling is a timetable and grief misses trains you think it should catch. Peter, who had a job that meant he could leave at 5 some days, took his son to Holborn and made him stand at the end of the platform and smell the warm metal the way men do to instruct boys in the rights of urban life, as if the smell of brake dust were a sacrament. He pointed to the curve where the spur went and said nothing. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder and kept it there through 2 trains, which is longer than it sounds, and the boy said nothing because he had been taught by kindness not to relieve the heaviness in other people with talk. He looked up at the clock and said, "It's not 5 minutes slow," and the man laughed like a cough because the right joke had found him and did not hurt. A year later, a station assistant on a late shift wrote on her phone, in the Notes app where she put shopping lists and reminders to water a plant she was determined not to kill, a sentence she did not know what to do with. "There is a seat in an old carriage that taught me what waiting is for." She had not, technically, been allowed down the siding, but curiosity is a transport worker's sin and salvation. She did not show the sentence to anyone, and later, when her phone died and took it, she missed it the way you miss a shortcut that only worked because construction had misdrawn the city for a week. London went on. The spur got a new lock with a code that would mean nothing to the next man. The carriage was moved to a depot where men with a craft's pride and the budget of a municipal department did for the family what the modern world calls conservation, which is a polite word for preventing a thing from becoming more honest than people can stand. They took the maquette that wanted to give up and gave it a thread to hang on with. They did not touch the ring of tea on the floor. They put a small sign in the window, "Please do not enter." The family went once, twice, then did not go because you cannot live in the afterroom forever. They took the notebook home, the one with the elastic, and put it in a drawer where a sock kept the pencil from denting the paper. Once, late, the son took the notebook out and put his thumb on the word tea and then went to the kitchen and put water on and stood there until the kettle made the sound it makes that makes you want to forgive the world for not being kinder. The last time someone used the phrase closure, the vicar winced and the widow smiled and the son said, "It's not that. It's a stop on the line. It's knowing that if you look at the map, there's a circle for it now." He meant he could point and say here. He meant the trains, when he heard them at night, because London will press a line of sound into any home that can afford to live, were no longer only arrivals. They were departures, too, and that was a mercy. He meant that somewhere in the city his father had sat with his hands on his thighs and his knees a little apart, because his boots made him, and had written in a book the word tea, because there would have been tea when he got home, and that was how a man endures a November evening and a strike, in the shape of other men's shoulders in front of him, and that to find the book was to find the promise still made even if it had not been kept. The city, which believes itself unromantic and is lying, made of him a small ritual. People began to leave enamel mugs on stairways, on plinths, on platform ends, though transport officers swept them because things left become hazards if they survive 6 hours. A poet wrote 6 lines that were good enough to hang in a carriage, and did for a day before someone took them, because words are souvenirs. A planner, looking at a map, drew a little dot near Holborn and wrote S38/YS, because even if the spur would never carry a train again, the map wanted to be exact. If you find yourself in a car late, between stations, when the light flickers and the carriage rocks and the world insists you remember you are underground, think of the way a room can become a carriage if you give it a door, and the way a carriage becomes a room if you take the door away. Think of a man who wrote lists to love his life, the way men do, and took a notebook in his pocket not to confess or to perform, but to remember butter and stamps and the story his son would tell at the kitchen table if only someone asked him to, and no one did, because time is savage and patient. Think of the elastic that held until it did not, and of the brass on a bracelet turned green, and of a photograph of 2 people at a lake that might be Shepparton or might be somewhere no one told the map makers about, because the best places never are. Think of the ring a mug leaves when it learns a floor. Think of the door that was heavier than a man could manage that evening, and of the men who opened it 50 years later, because finally someone gave them the work order. There is, in London, a comfort in knowing that a secret can last, and then give, like a carriage out of service that one day opens and turns into part of the story instead of the space between. There is, too, a duty to open the doors that do not need to be shut. One sign went up in the depot, Earnest as a prayer, check the room. It was meant for staff. It is for everyone. If you leave a train and see a man with a leather bracelet hold an enamel mug like a promise, ask him where he's bound. If he says Hounslow, tell him Holborn runs tight tonight, and the strike is off, and he should sit where the window is unpeopled and read his paper like it matters. If he says nowhere, stand until the doors close, and then open again at the next station, and make sure he steps off first.